Shall we begin?
Let's begin now. Let's begin now.
So let's first start with talking about all these different names for problematic sexual behaviors. So that's one of them, problematic sexual behaviors. And we like to add intimacy behaviors as well because it's not limited just to sexual behaviors. It's also emotional behaviors as well. So people can have emotional affairs just as easily, in fact, more easily than sexual or physical affairs because it's so nuanced that sometimes you don't even know you're doing it. So there's problematic sexual behavior, there's hypersexuality, there's compulsive sexual behavior, and there's sex addiction. And most people really don't like the term sexual addiction or sex addiction. It comes off as an indictment and a sentence at the same time. You know, it's not about offending, which is where a lot of people go with it. Problematic sexual behavior kind of covers everything. So it's all encompassing, which is also why we like to call it problematic sexual and intimacy behavior, because of that emotional piece that is so nuanced. Problematic sexual behavior is going to cover the gamut from infidelity to compulsive behavior like compulsive pornography watching, compulsive masturbation, to addiction where it is out of control. So problematic sexual behavior is a really nice catch-all. So let's talk about hypersexuality. So hypersexuality is really where we're saying that somebody's sexual behavior is above and beyond the norm, which of course norm is rather hard to define. Where we see this, though, is in people who have problematic sexual behaviors, although not the whole gamut, compulsivity and addiction. The hypersexuality label, though, is a little problematic, in my opinion, because when we're talking about somebody who is compulsive or addicted and you look at how much sex they're having outside of with their spouse. So by sex, I'm going to define that as anything that really takes you away from true intimacy with your partner. That could be masturbation, it could be pornography use. So this is the problem I have with the hypersexuality piece, is that hypersexuality would indicate that the person is hypersexual in every sexual realm of their life. So if they're having less sex with their spouse as a result of these other sexual behaviors, then I would hesitate to call that person hypersexual. One would think that hypersexuality would be, I'm having sex in so many different ways with my spouse, with perhaps other people, with pornography, with masturbation, with any other thing that you can think of. So that really is where I disagree with the hypersexuality piece, because if these other sexual behaviors are taking away from the sex with a person's spouse, then I wouldn't call that hypersexual. However, it's still problematic because you still have a spouse who probably isn't very happy. I have a rule, and that rule is if your spouse can't be standing next to you, waving her or his pom-poms, saying, "Yay, this is great behavior, this is what I want you to do," then really you're breaking the rule of intimacy within your marriage or within your partnership. So really, really important to keep that in mind. And I think as you move forward, if you are the person with the problematic behaviors, I think it's one of the most useful things that somebody who's acting out, who's trying to stop that behavior, to recover from that behavior and take a better path in life, a path towards true intimacy and connection, it's a really good indicator for you. Oh, yeah, this is not something I should be doing. Let's move on to compulsive sexual and intimacy behaviors versus sex and love addiction. These two have a lot in common because every addiction is compulsive. However, every compulsion is not an addiction. There's a significant reason why that is. For one thing, it's really how it works in the brain. Both are self-soothing behaviors. So if we're feeling anxiety or emotions that are very uncomfortable, let's say that your wife is crying, and this is not an emotion that you are particularly comfortable with, perhaps every cell in your body wants to run the other way, and so you want to shut that down and provide solutions and such. That's a self-soothing behavior as well. So people who, if you remember the show Monk, where he did a lot of things that were ritualistic behaviors in order to calm himself. And really that's what we're talking about, is self-soothing behaviors that calm you. With addiction, what's happening is, in very basic terms, and in another video I'll go into how the brain works, but what's happening is that dopamine, as the primary hormone, is being released. So dopamine is pleasure. With compulsive behavior, typically it isn't about pleasure, it's just about controlling that anxiety, those feelings, those untenable feelings. With addiction, there's a pleasure piece to it. And that doesn't mean that sex addiction or love addiction is fun. A colleague of mine, Rob Weiss, introduced that concept. It's not fun. It may start out as fun, but it's really not fun because it's something that the people who are doing this really don't like, even if they aren't particularly aware of it. And that brings me to the second piece that defines addiction, and that's denial. Compulsives are really quite aware of the fact that they're performing these behaviors in order to calm themselves. And they know something isn't right with it. And so they're really aware. A lot of addicts are not aware, or what is otherwise known as denial. Blissful ignorance even. But it's not so blissful because it is affecting every part of their lives, especially their relationships. The key difference is that the pleasure chemicals that are being fired off in the brain, and that is what creates the addiction, because the more that we engage in those behaviors and the more we feel these intense highs, because sex addiction and love addiction are about intensity. The person who has the addiction is mistaking intensity for intimacy because they never had a model. They never learned what real intimacy is. And that's part of what we're going to teach you how to do. That's what we do. That's why people come to us, to really learn ultimately how not to go into those behaviors that are so destructive, to go towards intimacy, which has to do with vulnerability, which is very difficult, especially if you're uncomfortable with emotions, with hard emotions. So that's something that we will help you with, not just in this video series, but also if you need our help on a clinical basis, coming in and seeing us, coming in for an intensive, giving us a call. We also do teletherapy where we work over a video system. We're going to talk in the next video about sexual compulsivity and addiction and love addiction and what characteristics there are surrounding those, so that you can have a good idea of what's going on. And we're going to give you a test that has been normed over thousands of people that'll help you determine what level of problematic behavior you have. This has been the introduction to what we do and some of those differences with the terminology. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'd love for you to join us for the next video.
Is that all you got?